Here's what we're making. Here's how we're making it. Let's get it. So I've just gone up and created a new substance. And I've come down to my new template here. And if you don't have this, I'll have a video in the description below that you can click on where we just create our own custom template here. I've also gone up and just named our graph cobblestone path, and then I've hit OK. So I want to start off by just holding down right click and dragging our base material into our view. So we're just going to use this as our viewer for our material so far. And so I want to start by creating the base geometry for our cobblestone. And we actually already have a node that pretty much sets us up for that called arc pavement. And so I'm going to drag this guy into our normal and our histogram range there. And I'm going to come in and modify a few things. I'm first going to come up to materials, go to default and edit. And then I want to come over to scale here, and I want to bring that up to 10 so that we're going to see our parallax occlusion on our material. And I also want to come to our normal map here, and I want to set this up to something like 5 for now. And it's not going to make a difference right now because we have a black and white map, but once we start adding more transitions, it's going to be more and more noticeable. All right, so coming over to our arc pavement here, we get a ton of different parameters that we can play around with. And so the first one I want to do is I want to take the pattern amount down. And so this is just going to decrease the amount of squares or tiles that we have across our arc. And you can see I'm going to bring it down to something like 5 because we want low numbers for right now for the initial stage, because the next stage we're going to use an edge detect. And it's going to get pretty messy if we have too much geometry. I also want to bring our arcs amount down. So this is just going to decrease the number of them vertically. And I'm going to go about 8. So we get a nice, pretty solid, not too dense pattern. We also get a bunch more parameters with the scale, width, and the randomness, but we're just going to leave that for now. We don't actually need to touch those. So the next thing I want to do, like I said, is I want to bring an edge detect into the flow here. And so what the edge detect is going to do is it's going to detect a stark contrast between our values here. And it's just going to basically round and also create kind of a widget here that we can increase or decrease the width. And so I want to bring the width all the way down to 1. Because it's going to give us some nice close detail so that the stones aren't too isolated. And I also want to come to our roundness here, and I'm going to bring this down, and this just rounds out the edges of our edge detect here. And so I'm going to bring it up just enough to something like, let's go 3.1. Let's see if that's good. Yeah, so I want to make sure that I'm not getting the little values in here, because I don't want them to bleed over and then kind of ruin the effect of the rocks and the specific tiles that we're going to get. And so with that, what I want to do is I'm going to add a flood fill node. And so what a flood fill node is going to do is give us these kind of coordinates or positions. And you can't really do much with the flood fill node here. You can see that you only have a drop down, but you can't really do too much with it. And the flood fill node is used to kind of set yourself up to use any one of these complementary nodes. And you can derive a lot of information just from the flood fill node. And it works very well when we have specific materials that are going to tile just like this, where they're each individual islands, like our cobblestone. So the node that I'm particularly interested in is the flood fill to gradient. And so I'm going to bring this guy in, and I'm going to take it and plug it into our flood fill. And you can see what this is going to do is it's going to take all of our islands here that we've used our edge detect on, and then convert it into just basically separate islands where we can play around with the gradient of each of the individual tile sets. So what I want to do is I want to crank up the angle variation on this And then I'm going to take this guy here and hit Control D, and that's going to duplicate it. And I want to, again, play around with the angles just a little bit. And I'm going to hit Control D again. And I'm going to play around with the angles once more. And so the reason that we did this, and we did it 3 times, is because we're going to use each one of these as kind of a slope to create the rock-like effect for our stones here. And so I'm going to create a blend node, and I'm going to plug in the bottom 2 here into our foreground and background. And I'm going to take our blend, and I'm going to set it to min darken. And you can see here what it's done is essentially taken each gradient and then blended it, giving us kind of this dividing line. And you can see if I play around with the angle here, we get a nice little dividing line separating between the rocks. And so this is going to give us a little bit of a slope on our rock here. And so I'm going to duplicate this blend, making sure to plug the blend into the background and our top guy here into the foreground. And now we're going to get kind of like a 3-pronged or a triplanar point on our rocks here. And again, we can play around with the angle variation just to give us some more random effects, and maybe so that we don't get 3 on every rock. One more thing that we can do with the flood fill is we can also come down to multiply by bounding box just to give us a stronger effect. And you can see, if I take a look in the blend here, it really starts to use that node as more and more influence on the overall texture. And so you can play around with that in the different nodes to really push around the points of your rocks. And so now I'm going to plug this guy in, and I'm going to see what it looks like. And so it's looking pretty good. We're getting a lot of angle variation in our rocks here. And you can also see with our histogram range, we've really decreased the contrast of the height map here, so that the ground is not too far away from the height or the height range of our rocks here. Now that I've got the cobble pattern down, I want to start by creating a cobble mask, and this is just going to allow us to remove at random any one of these tiles here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back up to our flood fill here, and I'm going to add a flood fill to random grayscale. And I'm going to plug this guy in, and immediately it's just going to randomly grayscale our edge detect here and just give it any random grayscale value. And so what we're going to be able to do with this is we're going to be able to take a histogram scan, and we're going to be able to just scan through the values. And you can see how we're going to be able to use this as kind of an intuitive mask, where we're just going to be able to randomly at will remove some of the tiles. And so I'm going to bring this up because we want to make sure that we have our white as our values showing up, or our tiles showing up. And I want to bring the contrast way up, because you can see if I dial this back a little bit, we start to get kind of a grayscale value that's not black or not white. And so what that's going to do to our tiles here is it's going to make it look like it's sinking in to the ground. And that's okay to a certain extent, but I want to make sure that we kind of have an on or off. So I'm going to bring the contrast right up to something like 0.95. And you can see now that it doesn't stay grayscale for too long. It's pretty much an on or off mask. And so how we're going to blend this together is if I just bring this over, and I'm going to add a blend node. And what I want to do is I want to take our blend here of our pattern, and I'm going to bring that into our background. And I want to bring the histogram scan into our opacity. And the last thing I want to do is I want to take a uniform color node, making sure it's set to grayscale. And then you're going to bring this into our blend on the foreground. And so now you can see once I start to kind of peel away our position here, we're going to get some values showing up. And actually, I'm going to invert the position. So now once I have it set to 1, we've got our full material showing up. And as I peel it away, we start to remove some of our tiles. And so a neat little trick that I've learned recently is if you go to any of the nodes on the output side and hold down Shift and click, you can actually take that output there and then bring it in, and it's going to basically replace the chain. And so now we can see in 3D what the effect is going to do once we start to peel away our mask. And this is going to allow us to expose the ground underneath and all of the detail that we're going to put. So now that we've got our mask working, I want to go ahead and start adding some edge detail or noise and wear and tear to these rocks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a slope blur grayscale, plug this guy in there, and I want to take our blend and I'm going to bring that into our top input there. And so I want to take a fractal sum base, and I'm going to use this for our edge wear and tear. So I'm going to plug that into our slope here. And immediately, like normal, it's going to give us a big, pretty noisy mess. And so we can come into our slope here, crank our samples up, and bring our intensity way down. And so we can start to make some sense of our patterns again, or our tiles. And so we're still getting kind of a stained glass look. So I want to come into our fractal sum base and I want to take our max level down. And this is going to decrease kind of the size or the density, I would say, of each of our panels here. And so for the first slope, I like to really use this as kind of our large edge wear, so that I don't want to have too fine detail, and I really want it to take bigger chunks out of our blocks here. And we can also play around with the min detail a little bit just to increase the strength. We can also play around with the global opacity again to increase the strength, as well as the roughness to kind of play around, find a happy balance. And if I come back into my slope, we can also play with our mode. And so what's going to happen with our mode is we can have a min, which is going to cut into our geometry. We can have a max, which is going to kind of bleed out of our geometry. And then blur is going to just try and blur the two together. Normally with a slope blur, I try and use the min because I like it to kind of take some of the detail out, like a chunk that's been taken out of our rocks. And especially because these tiles are allegedly man-made, we want to kind of keep a consistent form that looks a little bit more rectangular or square-like because they are man-made. So we've got that working. I'm going to add another slope blur grayscale. I'm going to take this fractal sum here and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to plug that in. So again, we want to increase the samples, bring the intensity way down. I'm going to go to min. And then we can again play around with our levels to maybe add a little bit more smaller detail. We can play around with our roughness, our opacity here. And you can see this is going to give us more of the edge damage or the wear and tear. This kind of works inside of the body of our rocks here. And we can play around with the min levels to eat away, playing around with the opacity. And you can really get a whole ton of effects, but this is kind of how I like to do it, with my larger detail as the first slope, and then my little smaller noise detail as our second here. So we've chipped away at our tiles here, our cobble, and now I want to go ahead and start creating the underlying ground material that we're going to have underneath our tiles here. So what I want to do is come out of the way over here, and I'm going to add a clouds 1 node. And I'm also going to add a clouds too, just to add some variety. And so why I have two clouds nodes here is the first one adds a little bit more noisiness, and the second one has a little bit larger forms. And so I'm going to blend these two together just as a nice, quick and easy kind of ground material. And I'm going to set the blending mode down to overlay. And so it's just going to give us a little bit of a quick and dirty ground or noise material that we're going to be able to use as the foundation for our mud or our dirt. So now I want to blend this together with our cobblestones here. And so to do that, I'm going to add a height blend node. And so with the height blend, it's pretty intuitive. You get on the top there your height top and your height bottom on the second one there. And so basically you want to think of this as kind of like it would be in real life, where what material are you going to have on the bottom and what material are you going to have over top. And so with the ground, we're going to put this in the bottom because it's going to be underneath our cobblestones here. And so I'll plug this guy into the top. And so I want to change the height offset just a little bit. And if we bring that up, you can see that our cobblestone starts to come through the blend or the dirt. And so if I steal this output there, you can see exactly what it's going to do on our material. And if I play around with the height offset, it's going to do exactly that, where it looks like the ground is almost absorbing our stones here. And the more we bring it down, the more effect the dirt has over top of our cobbles. And so I'm going to bring this up to around let's do 0.92 for now. Just so that we're getting kind of a nice little, kind of a nice height range between the two. I can also come over to our histogram range here, and I can crank up the range on our height output so we can see where our rocks have a little bit more height to them. And I'm actually going to bring that down to something like 0.85. And we can come back here and play around with our height offset until we find kind of a nice range that we like. And I kind of like that right now. And so now we've got both of our background and our foreground objects blended together. And so this part is totally optional, but I'm going to add it in just because I want to kind of populate our material a little bit more with some things that aren't just cobblestone and rocks. And so I'm going to come down here and I'm going to type in shape splatter, and I'm going to use the new shape splatter node that was in the Substance Designer 2018 or summer 2018 patch. And I'm going to bring this down off to the side, and you can see that we are able to plug in a pattern and a background height. Well, we've already got a background here, so I'm going to take this guy and plug him into our background. And what this is going to allow us to do, kind of like a tile generator, is we're going to be able to input a pattern, and it's going to basically splatter that pattern around our geometry. And we're going to have kind of full control with a ton of different parameters that's going to allow us to seamlessly blend in these patterns onto our background here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our menu here, and I'm going to start typing in leaf generator. And so this isn't a default node in Designer, but I have created a tutorial on how to make your own. So I'm going to link that in the description below. So make sure to check that out if you want to follow along. So I'm going to take our leaf generator here and plug it into pattern 1. And immediately you can see here that we're going to get a bunch of our leaves just tiling across our geometry. And so I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to, again, plug this guy in so we're able to see what's actually happening on our geometry here. We get a lot of small and uniform leaves. So we can increase the X amount and the Y amount so we get even more. We can also come down to our pattern input number, and you can see on our node here it says pattern 1. But if I increase this to 2, we're going to get a second input for a different pattern. And so with the leaf generator here, what I'm going to do is duplicate this guy, come into the parameters that we've exposed, and I'm just going to switch it to leaf type 2. And it's going to give us a different leaf. So I'm going to plug this guy in. And you can see in here, it's going to basically just randomly tile the two different leaf types that we have in. And you have a ton of different inputs that you can plug in a whole different slew of different patterns. I'm going to go back to 2 there. And I'm going to come down to where we have scale. And so right now our leaves are a little bit too small, I think. I want to make them just a little bit bigger. So we can increase the scale here, and it's going to bump up the size of our leaves. And that's maybe a little bit too small still. I'm going to go up to something like 2.5. And that looks a little bit better. We can also randomly scale the leaves so that they're all not the same uniform size. We also have an option to basically scale these without overlapping each other. And if I bring this up, our leaves are pretty much going to disappear, because what this is going to do is once we bring this up, the leaves are going to only scale to the biggest possible size that we've set, but without overlapping over top of another leaf. And you can see if I bring this down, the leaves are going to be overlapping over top of each other. So this is just going to help keep you from having your patterns overlap. Now with this specific pattern, it doesn't really matter because leaves are going to fall how they fall. And so it doesn't really matter if they overlap on each other, because that's how leaves would naturally fall. We also got a position random, and this is going to randomly throw our pattern just around our material here. And I like to switch our distribution just to uniform. And we can again just play around with the randomness to throw them all over the place. We can also come down to the rotation, and we can change the rotation uniformly. And we can also change the rotation random so that it's going to randomly just throw them around here. And now we get a new feature called height, and this is really cool. So we can change the offset of our leaves to make them taller or smaller, shorter, I guess, sink into our geometry here. So I'm going to bring that up a little bit. We can change the offset random so that it's going to randomly make some leaves have lighter values so that they're going to be more taller, and have darker values, so some are going to be a little bit sunken into our material here. We can also play with the height scale. So we can't really see too well in here, but basically the height scale is going to determine how much, kind of like our histogram range here, how much range we actually have to work with, the contrast of the height for the leaves. So if I come back, I'm going to bring that back up to 1 because I want to have the full range of height information for the leaves. We also get a really cool slider here that conforms to background. And so because we have a background plugged in, which is our tile with our ground here, we can actually conform the leaves to the background. So it's going to take in some of the background information and kind of try to blend it together a little bit. And when with the smooth conform, we can just smooth out those values so that it doesn't kind of make it transparent, but actually make it look more like it is bending over the geometry here. And so that is a very handy tool if you have something like these leaves where maybe they might be wet, so they're kind of conforming to the background of our ground here. As well, we can skew the slope of it to add a little bit more of an effect to the leaves so that they're a little bit rotated dependent on the slope or the gradient of the background. And so this tab right here with the height is very powerful and is a very handy tool to use when you're trying to splatter patterns around your geometry. The last thing I want to do is I want to come down to mask random, and I just want to randomly mask off a chunk of our leaves here so that it's not too overloaded with a ton of leaves. And again, you can play around with this to get a more nice looking material. But for now, we just want to mask off a ton of leaves, and we can see later maybe when we want to change things. So we've got our leaves thrown around our geometry here, but now I want to go ahead and create some more variation to kind of our debris that's around our cobblestones. And so I'm going to go ahead and start creating twigs. So to start doing that, I'm just going to add a shape node and I'm going to leave it on square. And I'm going to bring the X way down. And I'm going to bring the Y down just a little bit so that we don't have our edges touching both sides of the square here, or our texture set. And I'm going to add a bevel because I want to round the edges a little bit. And so that's a little bit too far. So I'm going to bring down our distance just to kind of something like that so that we get a little bit of a fall off on our shape here. And so I'm going to come down to smoothing just to make sure to round that out a little bit. And I want to come in and I want to just decrease the X size again. I want to make it a little bit thinner. Something like that. And so now I want to start warping this so that it's not too straight and make it look a little bit more organic. So I'm going to add a warp node, taking our height here into the input. I'm going to add a Gaussian noise. And I'm going to plug this guy into our gradient input. And you can see it's going to start basically just warping our twig around the noise input that we have. And I don't like how it's too small and a little bit finer detail. It's a little noisy. So I'm going to decrease the scale of our Gaussian noise to something around 13. We can also play around with the disorder a little bit. We can also play around with the intensity as well. So I'm going to probably have this around 0.8. I also want to come back to the bevel and I just want to decrease the fall off a little bit more so that it's a little bit thinner. And again, we can play around with the intensity and the scale. So now that we've got this kind of just generic twig, what I want to do is I'm going to bring these guys over up top so we have some more room to work. And I'm going to add a transformation 2D node. And I'm going to plug this warp tool into our transformation. And I'm going to take this warp guy and I'm going to just duplicate it. I'm going to bring it down here. And so now we've got two warps and a single transformation. I'm going to add a blend because I want to blend this bottom warp here with this transformation. And I'm just going to use this to create kind of a secondary twig or just some variety so that we're not blending the same twig across our material. So with our blend mode here, I'm going to come down to screen so that we can remove all of the black information from this texture here and just basically display it over top of our warp. So now with the transformation 2D, I'm going to just decrease this, making sure to hold shift. And you can see when I do that, it's going to tile our texture. So with our transformation, I'm just going to come up to where we have our tiling mode. I want to make sure to click on this guy and I want to hit absolute. And that's going to open this bar up for us to edit with. And I just want to hit no tiling. And then it's going to remove all of the tiled geometry so that we're only affecting just the one. And so now working with our 2D here, I'm just going to play around with it. And I just want to give it a little bit more of like a branching pattern so that this twig looks like it's got a little bit more going on than just, just kind of one stick. And that should be cool. So now we've got, these two different sticks warping, and I can even play around with the intensity of this guy here to make it look just a little bit different. And so now that we've got these two sticks, I'm going to start by adding a tile generator here. And I'm going to take this guy and plug him into the first input. And like we had with the shape splatter node over here, we can actually come in and go down to our pattern, click on image input, and then we're given the option to have multiple different pattern inputs. So I'm going to bring this up to 2, and you can see on the node here, it's going to now allow us to plug in a second pattern. And so I'm going to take this guy and plug him in. And so now we've got our 2 separate twig types. And so I'm going to come down and I'm going to take a look at all of our different parameters here. And so I want to scale our twigs up a little bit, bring up the scale random so that they're not all the same size. Again, playing with the offsets. Switch around the positions. We can play around with rotation as well, just to make it pretty random. I'm going to change the luminance random a little bit, just to give it some of them a little bit more sunken into our dirt and some of them a little bit higher up. We can also play around with the random mask to remove some of our twigs. And the last thing I want to do is I want to come down to blending mode and I want to switch it to max. And you can see here right now with our blending mode on add, whenever twigs are going to intersect with each other, they're actually going to add and create kind of a peak white value. But when I come down to our blending mode and hit max, you can see it looks like they're more so just intersecting with each other and kind of cutting through. And that's going to look a lot more realistic. So now that we've got all these guys here, I want to go ahead and create another height blend. And we're going to use this to blend the twigs on top of the rest of our pattern here. So I'm going to take the twigs and plug them in over top. I'm going to take our height and plug this guy in the bottom there. And I'm just going to take these output values and plug that into the output of our height blend here. You can see immediately that we're going to get our twigs pretty much trying to leap off our material here. And so all we have to do with that is I'm just going to play around with the height offset so that our twigs are pretty, sunken down into our material. I'm also going to play around with the contrast a little bit, and you can see here when I do that, it kind of gets rid of the border that's around these twigs. And so this is going to allow us to blend together our twigs with the rest of our material here. And again, we can go back and play with it to maybe, bring some of our twigs back. And now we can play around with all the parameters in here and see how it's going to affect the rest of our material. So now that we've got the geometry done, I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of our base material here. And I'm going to start by plugging in all of our outputs right into our output sockets down here. And so now with that, I want to also plug in a uniform color right into our base color here. And I'm going to bring that up to just a solid gray, just for now. And we're going to change that in a second here. And for our roughness, I want to go ahead and just take a curvature smooth node. And I use a curvature smooth node for our roughness because it gives us a lot of edge information that we can use to basically indicate the glossiness and the roughness of our material. And so we take the output of our normal here and plug that guy in. And you can see now that we get a lot of grayscale information from our normal map here. Except the problem is on a roughness map, the whiter areas indicate rougher areas and the darker values indicate glossier areas. So based off of this map alone, we can see that we kind of want to invert it because a lot of the darker areas are kind of in the recessed parts of our material here. So I'm going to plug that guy in. I'm just going to add a levels node. And with the levels node, I'm going to take our black input and our white input, and I'm just going to swap them so that we get this inverted texture here. So now that we've got those plugged in, I'm going to right click in our graph and view outputs in 3D. And you can see it kind of changes a little bit because now we're using these output nodes for the outputs of our material. And if we come back into our roughness, you can see once I crank up the black, it gets a whole lot smoother uniformly. And I'm going to bring that back. I also want to come down to our metallic here, and I'm just going to add a uniform color and plug that guy in. I want to make sure that I come over to grayscale so that we're using a grayscale node instead of an RGB. And I want to come up to the output size here because right now we're using a 2048 by 2048 texture size, and that's going to eat up our resources when we're loading this into another program. So to fix that, it's pretty simple. We can come up to our output size here, go to absolute, and I want to bring this down to 16 pixels by 16 pixels. And we're going to get this tiny little grayscale value, which is just going to be black. And because it's only one color value, we can make it 16 pixels without really affecting what the output is going to be. However, if we're going to bring this into Unity, which packs its roughness in the metallic map, we want to make sure that we're getting a 2048 by 2048 texture because the roughness is going to be the exact same size as we have our metallic set. And so I'm going to take a levels node here, if I can spell it, and I'm going to come up to our output size, and I'm just going to hit relative to parent. And so now this node is going to be the size of whatever we set our graph to be. In this case is a 2K texture. So we've got our outputs completed, and I want to go ahead and start working on the base color of our material here so that we're not just using a strict gray scale value. So what I want to do is I want to start by drawing all of our information from our height map here, or our height blend. And so with that, I'm going to create a gradient map, and I'm going to plug this guy right into there. And so what we're going to get is basically our grayscale value, and we're going to be able to convert it into a color value, which is denoted by this yellow socket here. And so immediately with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to plug it right into our base color output. And so if I delete this color here, you can see that we've just basically taken this texture and plugged that into our color. And this is going to be the basis for how we're going to construct our color with the different tiles, the different leaves and the twigs, as well as the background there. And so what I like to do is I like to give each of our bricks here first just their own kind of randomized colors. I like to bring a little bit of color into our geometry, our mesh. And so I'm going to add a uniform color node, and I'm going to just Control D these to duplicate them, and I'm going to bring in about 3. Over top of that, I'm going to bring in 3 different blend nodes, and I'm going to leave them on copy. And so all we're getting here is just a fairly black texture because we're just piping in black over black over black. And so with this, what I want to do is I want to start by creating a little bit of a mask to randomize which color values each one of these bricks is going to be mostly influenced by. And so how we're going to do that is we're going to draw from our blend over here, and we're going to use the height mask. And we're going to use this as kind of our mask for our geometry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another flood fill node, and I'm going to take the height mask and I'm going to blend that right into our flood fill. I'm going to bring this guy up over here to where we're working on our albedo. And so now what I want to do is I want to basically create the premise of our random colors. And we actually have a random color flood fill to random color node here. And so we can take this, and when we plug it in, it's going to give each one of our tiles a random color. And so the way we have the node right now, we can't quite plug it into the opacity because you can see that we have a RGB value trying to plug it into a grayscale value with the opacity. And so we can't do that. As well, I want to randomize it so that we're getting a different mask for each one of these blends here. So what we have to do is we have to go to an RGBA split node. And so what this is going to do is take in the color value, and you can see in each different output we're getting a different result for the mask. And so we're going to have different results by plugging in different sockets to each one of our blends here. So I'm going to take the red into the first one, and you can see immediately what the color value is going to give. I'm going to plug the green into the second one there, and you can see it's going to be a little bit different. And I'm going to plug the blue into the third one. And again, it's going to give us another different result. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by coming into our uniform colors here. And I'm going to give this one a little bit of a purple value. And I just want to bring the saturation down just a little bit so it's a bit of an off-white purple. And you can see as we go through, we start with the mask just basically influencing it so that we've got a solid purple here and a little bit less on some of the other bricks. And as we go along, we go to this uniform color here, and I'm going to give this one a bit of a green. Again, bringing the saturation down. And once we get to this one here, you can see that black, our color for this blend, has most influence on these different rocks here. And so I'm going to switch this guy over to something more like a kind of an orangey brown. And again, I'm going to bring the saturation down on that. We want to have very low saturation because it's going to look most realistic once we're done with the rest of our colors. So now the next part is that I want to go into our blends here, and I just want to bring the opacity way down so that we're not getting too abundant of, colors in one area, and we can still see kind of the height information over top. And again, for the purple, I think it's a little bit too much. So we just want to basically have these as a little bit of an off gray for now. And so now we've got the base color of our bricks down. I'm going to go ahead and start adding some cavity information, kind of like the edges and the recesses of the rocks here. Because you can see if we zoom in, we get a little bit of edge information along the center and the sides of our rocks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring our normal map back here. And like we did for our roughness where we used the curvature smooth, I'm going to use just a solid curvature node. I'm going to plug this normal map into this guy, and you can see immediately we're going to get some nice edge information. So I'm going to bring this guy up over top here. And what I want to do with this is I'm going to add 2 levels nodes. I'm going to take this guy, and I'm also going to hit Control D because I want to use this to both show the edge wear. And we're going to have a color for that we're going to blend in. And I also want it to show kind of the recessed areas where maybe more dirt is going to settle. And so for this, what I want to do is I want to crank the white all the way up, and I want to crank the black all the way up as well. And so we're going to use this one as our edge. And you can see here, as I crank the black up, we're really just going to get kind of the edges of our rock. And this is going to be nice once we apply this over top. We're going to have kind of some nice edge wear. So I'm going to add a blend node onto our chain. And I'm going to pipe in a uniform color node. And so I'm going to make sure that we set this guy to a little bit of a more white kind of color. And now once I pipe in our levels node here, you can see immediately it's going to just show up and give us some nice edge wear. And right now it's a little bit too much, so I'm going to just bring the opacity way down to something like 0.2, just a very, very subtle effect. But you can see that we're getting some edge wear over top of our rocks. And now I want to do the same thing for our levels down here. If I just move the connection node out of the way, that we can see where this guy is going there. I want to bring the white value and the black value very close together, but I actually want to invert them. So I'm going to bring the white on the other side there and the black pretty darn close. And so now this is going to be kind of along the insides there, the more concave edges of our geometry. And so the same thing, I'm going to add another blend node. I'm going to just duplicate this guy here, plug him in, and I'm going to make this more of a brownish color. And again, just kind of desaturate it a little bit. And now when I plug our levels node in, you can see that we're just going to get it along kind of the insides there. And if I play around with the opacity again to just have a little bit of an effect, maybe a little bit more, to around 0.4. You can see the effect that we have right here without any of these guys. And as we go along, you can see we're adding edge wear and then a little bit of dirt as well. And that's looking pretty cool. So we've got the base coating for our tiles done, but I want to go ahead and start creating the nice dirt and mud texture that we've got running underneath. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to add a fractal sum base node. And I'm also going to add a Gaussian noise. And so I'm going to blend these two together, making sure that we want to have our fractal over top, because this is going to be just kind of our noise for the dirt and just some of our softer values. And so we can come in and play around with some of our blending modes here. And I kind of like add sub. And we can also play around with the opacity if we have a little bit too noisy dirt or finer detail there. And we can also play around with the scale to maybe have something that's a little bit less noisy and a little bit more larger shapes. So something like that. And so with this, what we're going to do is we're going to basically take the height information from our dirt here, and we're going to run it through a slope blur. And we're going to use this kind of blend here as our factor for it. So I'm going to come back all the way to where we have our ground here, and I'm going to create a gradient map. And like we did with the tiles, all we're doing is we're taking our grayscale value and we're just going to convert it into an RGB value. So while I take this guy over here, I'm going to come over into our parameters and I'm going to click on our gradient editor. And so this is going to give us a nice color value chart here. And we're also going to get a spectrum. And if we just click on the spectrum, we're going to get both our black and our whites. And we can play around with these two, basically do the same thing that a levels node would do, and even invert them and move them around. And it's going to use our grayscale image that we put and the gradients basically as an indicator where along the gradient we're going to have different color values. And so if I bring this guy in here and I switch it to a red, you can see that if the more I move it towards the right side, it's going to encompass the lighter values and the darker values of the material. And I can bring the black up as well. And I can also bring this back down. And so it's going to be a lot closer to the darker values in our input texture here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play around with some darker brown mud looking materials or values here. And we're just going to get some interesting looking result on our mesh here. Okay, and so we've got some interesting looking values here, and all I've done is just basically played around with a bunch of different brown values and just slid them up and down to get something that's a little bit interesting to look at. And so with this guy here, what I'm going to do is take a slope blur, and I'm going to use the value that we created, the grayscale here, just to plug into our slope blur here. And you can see right now we have way too low samples. And the intensity is way too high. And if we bring this right back down, you can see it's going to give us some interesting looking results for our mud here, but it looks a little bit too muddled. We can also play around with the mode here, and I like to go for either min or max. In this case, I'm going to go with min. And I also want to come into our fractal sum base, and we can also play around with the max level and min level of our parameters here to play around with the result of the fractal sum. You can also play around with global opacity to maybe blur a little bit. And it's just going to basically randomize our mud a little bit so that we get some interesting results. So I'm going to bring all these guys down just a little bit so we have more room to work. And so the next thing I want to do is I'm going to bring in a dirt 1 node. And what I want to do with this dirt 1 is I just want to use it as some more variation to our mud, because I don't think we have enough random blotches of just, little stones or little rocks or air pockets or anything that you would find in mud. And so I'm going to add a gradient map to this guy. Coming back into the gradient editor, just kind of find a nice brown material, more towards red there. Desaturate it a little bit. And I'm going to really crank up the color value there. Bring up the black a little bit too. And so what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to blend the two together, making sure to have the bubbles here, our dirt, on top. And I'm going to come into blending mode, and I want to find screen, because what screen is going to do is just remove any of the darker values of these air pockets here. And it's only going to keep the actual bubbles that we want. And so now you can see that we get a lot of air pockets around. Now, one thing I want to make sure of is that it looks a little bit too uniform. And so I want to just mask off certain areas where we're going to have more or less of the dirt. And so I'm going to take our Gaussian noise down here that we have. I'm just going to plug that guy into the opacity. And so now we're getting some more in different areas over here and a little bit less over here kind of deal, just to break up things a little bit more. The last thing I want to do is I want to add an HSL node, a hue, saturation, and lightness node, because it's a little bit too saturated for me. So I want to come into our saturation and desaturate it. Like I was saying earlier with the rocks, it's going to give us a little bit better of a result. Increase the lightness a little bit, and again decrease the saturation. A little bit too much on the lightness, and something like that. So now I'm going to blend these two together using a blend node, making sure that we want our rocks in the top there, and we're going to want to have our ground underneath. And just like we masked off our rocks over here using the mask that we got from the height, I'm going to come back down, take this guy over here, and I'm going to plug this into our blend so that we're only getting the rocks showing up on top and we're getting the background showing up underneath. And you can see here, it's doing exactly like we want it to. Now I want to go ahead and just bring in some color for our twigs here, and that's going to be pretty easy. So I'm going to add a blend node here, making sure again to just take the output and the output there. And I'm going to come down and I'm going to find where we've blended together our twigs with the rest of our background here. And I'm going to take the first input, the height, and I'm going to use this as our foreground here. And again, because we're taking a grayscale and bringing it into a color node, we need to just use a gradient map and just convert our grayscale to color. So I want to mask just the twigs off in our selection. So I'm going to come back to where we drew the height from for our color, and I'm going to use the height mask because we actually get a nice little mask for all the geometry that we've tiled across and blended with the rest of our height. So I'm going to click on this guy. And I'm going to come find our blend, and I'm going to use this as the opacity. And so now you can see it's only going to color our twigs with our gradient map node over here. And so with our gradient map, I'm just going to do a little bit of softer browns just to get a nice looking twig. And again, you can go into way more detail than this, and it's essentially the same like what we did for our height over here, where we're just trying to distort and add a bunch of color variety. So when we take a look at our blend here, you can see that we are getting some distinct twig color information. So now the final thing I want to start bringing color in from is our leaves here, so that they're not just the background texture. And so with the new shape splatter node, we actually have a really handy feature that we can use. So I'm going to come back to where we have done our leaves, and I'm going to type in shape splatter, and we want to do blend color. And so with this node here, we're going to get a few similar outputs or inputs that we get from our shape splatter output here. And you can see with the splatter data 1 and 2, it's going to be pretty much the most crucial information that we're going to draw from our shape splatter. We can see when we plug our shape splatter 1, we're going to get the foreground or splatter information, and plugging in shape splatter 2 is just going to give us the background information, which right now is going to just be transparent. So I'm going to bring this up now that we have the connections. And it even has an actual input for our background color. And so we can just use the current albedo that we have going as our background color. And then we can actually plug this guy into our final output. And you can see now it's going to accept our running chain here, and then it's going to use all of the extracted data from our shape splatter with the masks and everything that we have from the background. So now I want to go ahead and start by adding our color input into our node here. And so I'm going to take this uniform color, and I'm going to plug that into our pattern 1. And when we play around with our color here, you can see that it's going to change all of the color of the leaves. And so I want to go up and I want to find kind of a darker, desaturated kind of green. And so I'll exit out of that. And so you can see that it's colored all of our leaves that same uniform color, but we did have 2 different patterns in our shape splatter that I want to have just kind of different colors, and I want to kind of randomize the 2 colors that we input across all of our leaves here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this guy up, just Control D to duplicate, and if I come into our shape splatter, I'm just going to go down to pattern number, and I'm going to bump that up to 2, and you can see now it's going to use our pattern 1, which we've indicated down here as being the green color, and because we have nothing plugged into pattern 2, it's just going to give it a black. So I'm going to plug in this second one here into pattern 2. I'm going to come into our colors here, give it a little bit of a different green, and you can see now it's updated to give pattern 2 all of the same color and pattern 1 all of the other color. And now I kind of want to randomly assign them, and we actually just have a slider in here that's going to randomly assign different leaves to different colors. And this is really handy to just kind of randomly give us a nice looking result for our splatters, and there's really no work involved in doing it. And now the final thing that I want to do is I'm going to just do another hue, saturation, and lightness pass over top of our entire material here, because I still want to decrease the saturation of our rocks just a little bit. I want to make sure that we have kind of a uniform pass over top of everything we've done. So I'm just going to decrease the saturation just a little bit so that our rocks are no longer too saturated with color, and they're a little bit more of a gray value. We can also increase the lightness up a few points just to kind of compensate for our desaturation of our material.